So my name is Selbi. I am originally from Turkmenistan. It used to be part of the Soviet Union. I hadn't been in Turkmenistan for 14 years. So I'm just going to quickly tell my positionality so you will know where I'm coming from. Most of my education was, all of my higher education was in English. And I did only 9 years of high school because that was the policy back then in Turkmenistan with the president. And yeah, as I said, all of my higher education was in English. Practically all of my higher education was sponsored by Soros Foundation. I am a human rights lawyer. I worked with human rights in Kazakhstan. I lived in Kazakhstan as well for 7 years, but still I studied in always studied in Anglo-Saxon universities. So, yeah, and it's a bit ironic that I'm talking about decoloniality in English, living most of my life in the global north. I'm currently living in England, working in Germany. I've been in England for over 5 years now, so I do recognize the irony of that, and I am a bit alienated from the context. And I try to go back to the context, even though I can't go back physically. And I was for a long time quite a strong advocate for human rights. It was almost like my religion. So it was my only belief system that I had for a long time, particularly when I saw how it gave hope to people with whom I worked, particularly women who were victims of sexual violence. So, and right now it was a lot of rethinking where I come from. Also, I am a researcher of Russia, which is also puts me in quite an interesting position because usually when we talk about decolonizing research, we talk about global North academics going to global South. And this creates certain power asymmetries. But in my case, it was vice versa. I am from periphery, and I go to the metropole. I did my research in Moscow and St. Petersburg. So it also created certain dynamics. And I researched Russian liberal opposition as well, which also I saw particular attitude towards me because I'm Central Asian. So yeah, that's in terms of my positionality. I will be giving quite a regular format lecture. In the end, we will do some collective reading, which would leave us enough space to, hopefully, for questions. So let us open our conversation with Pluriverses, created by famous fiction writer Ursula Le Guin. And more precisely, more precisely with her Hainish cycle. In her book, 4 Ways to Forgiveness, we have 2 neighboring planets. One is Yove, and another one is Verel. She's quite specific in how you pronounce them, and I'm pretty sure that I'm not mispronouncing them. So Verel colonized Yove and ruled over Yove for a certain time. The enslaved peoples of Yove have recently thrown a rebellion against the Verelians. After the fight for independence, both planets are left now in a turbulent state. Yove peoples need to figure out how to newly organize themselves and fight the misogyny entrenched in their culture. Ursula Le Guin argues that for the brave revolutionaries, quote, freedom and duty both begin in the heart. Verel must deal with the loss of Yove and, quote, the master's power over the enslaved people of their own planet seems to be on the brink of unraveling. In Yove, a superficial equality exists, but they entrenched colonial policies and violence into the domestic governance as well. So as we can see on 2 planets, despite the fact that one is a colonizer, another one is colonized, there is quite a turbulent situation. And they are now trying to figure out how to live together. In the story of Yove and Verel, we can see that coloniality outlives settler colonialism. So even though the settler colonialism is over, coloniality still persists. and much mending work is to be done on both planets. Le Guin stresses the idea of mutual respect that is, quote, the delicate balance of responsibility and freedom which makes a successful relationship. So today we will be looking at coloniality, which persists even after colonization. And at the same time, we will see how decoloniality, with its popularity, became corrupted. Previously, the global North states launched conflicts in the name of human rights, but now non-Western states justify their colonial pursuits in the name of the colonial struggle. And we know one state about which we will be talking more today. What we aim to establish today is that the denial of rights and violation of international law is per se not decolonial. Human rights do need to be decolonized, and so is the international system. But it's not an excuse to violate human rights. Decolonization becomes a new comfortable pretext to violate human rights because they are the product of colonial structures. But there is something deeply colonial in such logic as well. The goal of today's session is to see how and at what points the colonial and human rights agenda diverge. How do we work with a system that is built broken? Is decolonization the same as de-Westernization? Is the decolonial struggle only about paving a way from European and global North's modernity? Why is it possible for the struggle then to be co-opted by authoritarian states? Are the human rights at fault, or is it decoloniality? Do we need to decolonize human rights and decolonize decoloniality? So I will attempt to answer these questions by first looking at how and why Russia misappropriates the colonial agenda, more precisely asking whether Russia is indeed a disobedient state. Second, we will see why these claims are ironic, given that they come from, one, a country that externally and internally colonized and continues to do so, B, a country that engages in non-ethics of war and conquest, C, Russia was also designing the current international law infrastructure, so it participated in it as well, despite the fact that it now denies that. So, and we will look at the Soviet Union's complicity in that as well. And third, we will look at why human rights became an easy scapegoat and pretext for non-Western colonizers. And what would it mean to unlearn and rethink human rights? And why they are not a sovereign project. The rights are not a sovereign project. So first, we will be doing a critique of Mignolo. Second, we will be doing a critique of Russia. And third, it will be a critique of human rights. And we'll see how it all comes together. So quite an optimistic agenda for 2 hours. So this lecture was inspired by the blog post that I recently written. If you need, I have most of the books that I mentioned. If you need any of the books, I have them in electronic copy. If you need this presentation, I'll have it in electronic copy. If you need any of the blog will be there hopefully soon. So this lecture was inspired by Walter Mignolo, with whom I have quite difficult relationships. Precisely because he claims that Russia and China are the disobedient states, working their way to de-Westernization, delinking from the unipolar Western order, quote, dismantling international world order. Mignolo argues when talking about Russia and others, quote, they are simply disobeying and working on the reconstruction of their own needs and interests. They are not attacking, but defending themselves from the harassment of Western designs. End of quote. And this is quite noteworthy given that he said it in 2023. He argues that the fall of the Soviet Union resulted in the, quote, neoliberal celebration of the end of history, which showed modernity's darker side. He argues that Russia and China do not have history of settler colonialism, with which we disagree deeply, and that they co-opted capitalism. He makes a distinction between de-Westernization And he says that decolonization. He says de-Westernization implies capitalism but rejects neoliberalism. So basically, he says that Russia, China, and the like are capitalist states but not neoliberal. Therefore, they're engaged in de-Westernization. At the same time, I think he says quite good things as well in that very same blog. He says that decolonization is not a state-regulated project. So a state cannot claim that the state decolonizes. Russia cannot say, oh, we are decolonizing something. Simply because, as again Walter Mignola says, decolonization and nation states are bad bedfellows. So they simply do not go together. Decolonization as a project is against nation states. Because the struggle of decolonization always belongs to people. So with that in mind, let's move on to somebody who I guess was inspired by Walter Mignola. I've analyzed Putin's speeches from the start of the war, from February 2022 to 2023. I've read them, so you don't have to do that. And I pulled out some extracts of what he was saying. So when I thought about the title, I mentioned that Russia is not a decolonial ally, but the reality is Russia doesn't want to be a decolonial ally, they want to be the leader, surprisingly. So he was saying that Russia led anti-colonial movement, that Russia helped to fight colonialism in Africa, that what Russia is doing, and most of his speeches are, of course, about Ukraine, though he mentions Ukraine quite rarely. Quite interestingly, I did a text analysis to see which words were reappearing most frequently. The word war wasn't reappearing at all. Quite a lot was on economic gain and economic development, surprisingly, I don't know why. So he's saying that Russia is adopting an anti-hegemonic position, that the West cannot unilaterally manage all of humanity, and a solidarity between humans should be created. I think he clearly read Mignola or maybe other decolonial collective writers. He also says that the world has changed and over 200 million people live in Africa now. He talked a lot about BRICS, how president of Indonesia is his brother and they call each other brother, same with China. So BRICS, I'm sure you know, it's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. He also said that racist and neo-colonial West, which takes especially ugly forms, particularly after the creation of the so-called unipolar world. Quite interestingly, he uses the term unipolar world, same as Decolonial Collective, they use that term. And the last phrase is, I find it quite interesting. So he says, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, which we allowed with our own hands, we assumed, for whatever reason, that we are about to become a part of the so-called civilized world. As we found out later, they did not want us, despite all of our efforts. So basically what he's saying that we were trying to be friends with them, with Europe, with the Global North, but they just didn't want us. And it's quite interesting, and it refers to what Madina Tlostanova called as, labeled as Russia being a Janus-faced empire, that it both considers itself humiliated, it both considers itself inferior towards the West, and better than Africa or Asia or Global South. So, yeah. And Madina Tlostanova was saying that Russia was attempting to out-West the West, and they are self-orientalizing. This term orientalization that comes from Edward Said, but she was saying that it's a self-orientalization, saying that we are so unique, we are so different, we try to be friends, but they just don't want us. And this is all very, very ironic. Why? Because as we know, the country was involved in internal and external colonization. This is the term which was coined by Alexander Etkind in 2011. I'm aware about the controversy with respect to his recent book. I fully support the position of people from Ukraine. But I pre-ordered the book. Will probably read it. But the 2011 book, I found it quite interesting. Because it's 2011, it's before 2014, he already labels Russia as a colonizing empire. Nobody was doing it back then. It only became popular to talk about it like that today, more recently. And he differentiates between imperialism and colonialism. And he says that imperialism typically does not involve the travel abroad. So it happens within. He also argues that, quote, for an empire such as Russia's, its culture was both an instrument and of rule and weapon of revolution. Having colonized its multiple territories, Russia applied typically colonial regimes of indirect rule, coercive, communal, and exoticizing to its population. Even after the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russia still was left with more than European states in the post-colonial era, as Russian Empire was both, quote, the largest in space and the most durable in time of all historical empires. And we should also understand where Etkin comes from. He is, I kind of wish he would go more into that and he would explain and historicize, but he is a cultural studies person, literary studies person, so he looks at literature and the role of literature and culture, which of course in Russia was quite enormous. But he gives an example of St. Petersburg, and he says that St. Petersburg in the 19th century was like a metropole, center of colony. And the rest of Russia was colonized and internally colonized, and he gives a parallel of Italy, saying that the north colonized the south, but adopted the south as culture. And he also talks about the fact that in St. Petersburg in the 19th century, higher society spoke French, and then working class spoke Russian. So he sees in that some kind of form of internal colonization as well. So not only Russia expanded through the Great Game and other games, but it also applied colonial policies within. He also gives an example, maybe this is interesting, of Tolstoy, that initially Tolstoy's War and Peace was written in both French and Russian, but certain parts were only in French, because he assumed that everybody who will read it will understand French. But then the later edition, they had to translate it. He also uses quite an interesting concept, which was developed by Hannah Arendt, the boomerang effect, which means that, and he gives example of India, and he actually compares Russia to India quite a bit. He says that what boomerang effect means that colonial powers, they create laboratories of modernity, and then they apply the worst policies of colonialism back home. So, yeah, that's the Etkin stand. So, Mignolo, Putin, Etkind, and now let's go move on to human rights. No, sorry. And this is another article. It's quite curious because it was written in 2007, but if you read it today, it resonates quite a bit. So he talks about Stalin's role in nationalism. And civilizational communism, I think he talks about that. He doesn't use this term, but I think I label it myself because it comes from, maybe somebody will guess another term, by Françoise Verger. Who will guess? Feminist, civilizational feminism. So what is civilizational feminism?
It's an assumption that what we want, what feminist changes are going to go to different countries, that they do it good.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
nation or of the cultural state.
Yeah, this was the term that was coined by Verger, and she says that we saw that quite a bit with Beyonce being a feminist, and she critiques white feminism, saying that this is not the struggle of a lot of people. This is not feminism for 99%, and often feminism was also co-opted in order to colonize. On of itself, of course, we all need feminism, but it shouldn't take the civilizational forms, and we will talk about that as well. But yes, so basically, what he does, he quotes Stalin, who says that who talks about Russian proletarian vanguard. So what does it mean? It means that Stalin saw Russian people as the leaders, the moving force of the revolution. He also said, Stalin also said that Lenin is the biggest achievement of Russian communism, and the communism was meant to civilize the quote peripheral nations or backward nations. So communism was taking quite a nationalist term, and it's quite different from Lenin. And I think if Lenin would see that, he would turn in grave, except that he's not really in grave, so it couldn't possibly happen. But it's quite a stark contrast between Lenin and Stalinism. And it made me think, because I also write about far-right in Russia, that why Stalin is so appealing. Not only because of paternalistic, strong-hand figure, not only because he was both a victim and poor and modest, but at the same time the strong hand, strong man rhetoric, which we very much see in Russia, but also because he was the author of Russian nationalism. So basically this is what this article says, which is, I think, quite unusual, quite revolutionary. And he says that it was the Russian proletariat who would lead the revolution and who would civilize the rest. And the rest we know. We know that Russian was the main language. We know that, we know what happened. Okay. So, quite an interesting reading of communism that we see. So let us move on to human rights. So we looked at Mignolo, Putin, we looked at external and internal colonization in Russia, we looked at nationalism during the Soviet Union, and now let's see how human rights rhetoric plays into that as well, and why it needs to, human rights themselves need to be decolonized. Again, quite a famous quote by Ursula Le Guin, to make a thief, make an owner, to create crime, create laws. So maybe somebody can tell me from which book it's taken, the famous book of hers. Yes, yes, Dispossessed, absolutely fascinating read, if we can imagine. And I think right now we experience the failure of imagination, and she takes us quite further away. And also Madina Tlostanova was saying that artists are way ahead than theorists. So human rights. As we know, Russia doesn't like human rights, but it doesn't say so directly. And human rights is indeed a colonizing project, but let's quickly look at how they emerged. Why do we have them? What is the problem with them? So Hannah Arendt in 1949, it was a response to Karl Marx. Karl Marx wrote 100 years ago, before her, an essay about rights as well. For him, rights were rights to have property. For her, rights were the right to have rights, a very famous phrase from her very famous essay. And it was based on her experience. So what was her experience? What was very important for her? Holocaust? Yeah, Holocaust, and she was stateless, basically. Yeah, she was stateless, and she was, for her, rights were a right to be a citizen. So only for her, only citizens have rights. And for her, and it was in light of many denaturalization laws in Europe. And she was in that limbo as a person who does not have any rights. So she starts to think about that. And she calls it expulsion from humanity. And we could see that early in philosophy. Aristotle was saying that a man is a political animal, so to have rights is essentially to participate in politics, for Aristotle. And it was written in response to 1948. What was in 1948? Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There are quite a lot of, this is the so-called Bill of Rights. So we have a particular situation. We have World War II that just finished, and as our professor of human rights philosophy, he would say that all of a sudden, countries realize that there is something about humans that entitles them to rights. So all of a sudden, in 1948, we have rights. And so UDHR, it's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. From the name, you can see that it doesn't have any legal effect because it's a declaration, but some provisions of this declaration are considered to be customary law and therefore are binding on countries even if they did not ratify it. And this is quite a problematic document in many respects, widely critiqued by the left, widely critiqued by philosophers. Then we have ICCPR, it's International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of 1966. And this is a binding document. Then we also have International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights of 1966, which is binding. Interestingly enough, if we think about the historical situation, which country do you think lobbied for ICCPR? For International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Who was the main? Who was the main? Oh no, it's not here. Who was the main driver behind it? For whom economic, social, and cultural rights were important? For which bloc? As opposed to civil and political rights. And civil and political rights are freedom from torture, freedom of speech. USSR. USSR was lobbying for International Covenant for Economic and Social Cultural Rights. So it was one of the main lobbies. It's quite a fascinating document because it's very different from regular obligations of which we find in international human rights documents. And I'll talk about that later. And then we have specific documents, and we will talk about them. I'm not going to bore you quite. If you're interested, we can talk about them more during Q&A. So we have this text, and Ariela Aisha Zolai calls them the textual rights or sovereign rights, which emerge from international system. So international system, the main actors in international systems are states, yeah. States are the main actors, and the idea behind human rights is that states violate human rights, not individuals. Yeah, right now we have an arrest warrant by International Criminal Court against Putin and the Ombudsman on Children's Rights. So, is this human rights? The question. Because there is always mixing up with this too. And no, it's not. It's a different body. There is international law, and there are different bodies, and international criminal law is a different body as well. Why? Because there the violators are people. Yeah, Putin and Ombudsman. For human rights, the violator is always the state. And if we think about it, it's quite a beautiful idea that there are states and human rights were created in order to protect people against the state. So it's people against the state, but it doesn't always work this way. So human rights have been critiqued quite widely, and I will be using an image of Hydra from mythology. So why do you think Hydra? What was so specific about Hydra in myths? Yeah. So if you cut one head, more heads appear. So International lawyers, they were understanding that, well, there are some problems and we need to address them. So let's look at these problems. One problem is that they are universal, universalizing, and they are not culture specific. So how do we deal with that? Partially in response to that, regional mechanisms were created for human rights protection. We know one very well, European Court of Human Rights, which no longer has jurisdiction over Russia. So there is also lesser known one, Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Now they are interestingly looking at the case of, among all other cases that they're looking at, is with respect to abortion in Uruguay. Let's see where it goes. But it's quite a progressive state in many respects, particularly with respect to reparations. And we don't hear about it as much as we hear about the European Court of Human Rights for obvious reasons. Then there is Inter-African Court of Human Rights. And this one is also quite interesting because it's based on the charter. And it's not only about human rights, it's a charter of human and people's rights. So here we have group rights as opposed to individual, because often the critique of human rights is that they are too individualistic. They also emphasize freedom from slavery due to historical background. And interestingly, this charter also has duties. So it doesn't only talk about rights, it also talks about obligations of people, which is quite interesting and lesser known. So another head was that implementing human rights is expensive. It's not free of charge. So what do we do with that? And for that, again, this international ICCR, International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, is quite interesting because it talks about progressive realization of rights. It says that, okay, we understand not every state can equally implement rights, but let's see how you can progress slowly towards a certain goal with consideration of resources. So resources are unequal. Also, another head that was cut off, but more heads were created, is something that is called limitation clause. So practically all human rights provisions have a limitation clause, which usually the design of an art, you can see I get excited when I talk about law. I'm totally boring to some people. So usually it's the first provision would say you have a right to freedom of speech, let's say. And the second one would be limitation clause, which would say, but it should respect group rights, it should not interfere with the rights of others, it should protect children, etc., etc. So within the design of the rights themselves, there are ways to not make them so absolute other than certain rights which are absolute. I think this is interesting because I've read an essay by Zizek who said that there is a right to choose, which doesn't really exist. So in law, it doesn't really exist. And that's why I think the best critique and the strongest critique comes from within the field. Okay, moving forward, human rights. But in reality, this Hydra disregards a much, much bigger monster and a dragon. And because we have the theme of Ursula Le Guin today, I use the dragon, but dragons are sometimes positive characters in her novels. But yeah, but there is a much, much bigger elephant in the room. So what would that be? Bigger elephant with respect to human rights. But well, the reason why we did this exercise, if we go back to Russia again, is to say that Russia participated. Yeah, the Soviet Union participated and Russia very much participated. It plays by the rules. And if we would listen to the speeches of Putin from 2014, when he talked about annexation of Crimea, he was using legal language. And no country in the world would say, oh, we don't like human rights, we violate them. No country would ever say that. But all countries violate human rights. But they are Russia was very much participating, not only in observing them, but very much participating in designing these measures. And right now they're saying, oh, well, we have nothing to do with them. When in fact, it did have something to do with them. But the bigger problem and elephant in the room is how did they emerge? How did they come?
trade among countries in the globalization?
Yeah, that's actually a good point, because before UN there was labor organization, and trade was quite a big issue. And with the emergence of nation states, trade was very big. Yes, that's indeed true. But also a very, very big issue was that allies were colonizers. So after World War II, allies covered up the colonizing history by rights. And we see that very much in the United Nations Charter. There is one of the chapters is on trusteeship council, and it no longer exists, but it was meant to administer colonial territories. So, and for that, it's I find work of Ariela Shazolai totally fascinating. If you ever read one book about human rights and decolonization, that would be it. I would really recommend. So she says that the post-World War II situation was instrumentalized by allies who covered up their colonial crimes with a newly established institutionalized framework of imperial rights. So she differentiates between two types of rights: imperial rights, and another one, she calls them differently throughout time. She calls them disabled rights, which I don't really like because it's ableist language, but I prefer to say civil rights, or the rights of the dispossessed. But the reason why she calls them disabled is that in order to have human rights, states will first take these rights away from you in order to give them as a gift, in order to grant them to you. And this was what happened, not only to cover up the crimes of colonialism and create a new system, but also to take them away. Imperial rights or sovereign discourse of rights are opposite of what she calls, that mentioned, the rights of dispossessed and their lost worlds, the rights validated not by state. So the minimal set of rights is, quote, a preventative measure to keep people in bondage in order to protect and maximize the exploitability of their enslaved bodies. End of quote. They represent a structure to secure the privileges of the few. So quite a critical reading of human rights. And she says, and she offers solutions. What do? We reverse, we give reparations, we withdraw the privileges, and she talks quite a bit about incommensurability, and I'll talk about that in a second. She also works with archives, and her primary case studies are Palestine and Berlin after World War II. And quite interestingly, she looks at photographs, or what is there in archive, and she says that it's equally important to see what is not there, so the erasure narrative. And she would even take certain photographs and she would draw on top of them certain people who should be there, but they are not there. And she says that these rights, the rights of people, they cannot really be taken away by state because they are always there. And she says that the interrelation between disabled and imperial rights needs to be studied. And, quote, as people were uprooted and their world ruined, an abstract universality of rights originated from this near worldliness. So she says that people's lives and worlds were destroyed, and often people need to create these worlds anew by the state. The states take those rights away. And she gives very particular example, that is example of migrants. So oftentimes people are denied of rights in their communities, which forces them to flee. Yeah, and the book is called Potential History, and she often works with different objects. She has a book about different objects as well, and the discussion about the return of confiscated property during colonialism is quite big right now, particularly with respect to museums. So yeah, that is the critique, and I think what is important here is to say that certain rights, they exist, but they do not come from the state. They are not the rights of the sovereign states. They are not the rights that are given by nation states, but rather the rights that are born out of liberation movements, that are born out of protests. So she says, a recognition of the modalities by which people continue to exercise and claim rights even in impaired worlds, even in the master's house, that they insist on transforming, at least in part, into their homes. Yeah, again, I think he quite clearly here hints on migrants, that they lost their world, they lost their home, but they find it somewhere else. And she draws on Hannah Arendt's concept of worldliness, saying that it doesn't mean that these people don't have a world. They just can't live in the world as in a safe place. They don't feel at home in the world, as she famously put it. And she also says that it doesn't mean that these people do not have worlds. They just need to create them anew. And it's quite a beautiful process, but it comes from a very, very high cost. And who she talks about the wretched of the earth, as was famously coined by Fanon. She talks about those whose future is mortgaged. Again, the most marginalized. So what do we do with human rights? We need to abandon liberal teleology, so liberalism should not be seen as an endpoint. And we can see very much whenever there are protests, the governments are quite unhappy and they want to take away certain rights that are born out of those protests. We need to strive towards co-citizenship, a partnership against imperial citizenship. Then maybe somebody can tell me about this article, very famous article in Decolonial Studies by, maybe you know the authors. Yeah, Tuck and Young. It's been quite critiqued by Decolonial, and it's quite interesting how quickly things changed, because I think in this summer this was like the article. I think it was written a while ago, 2001, by Tuck and Young, and it's called "Decoloniality is not a metaphor." And in this article, they argue that decoloniality is not an empty signifier, but in fact, it's a dirty, messy, difficult project. Decoloniality is an urgent project, so there is this urgency, and quite a beautiful phrase of incommensurability, which means that we cannot compare it to anything. And I speak, for example, from the position of academia, because I see that everybody decolonizes everything. Before, everybody was deconstructing everything, now it's decolonizing everything. And often people think, oh, it's just an easy tick. I will just insert a few names of Black authors in my curriculum. Here we go, decolonized academia. But in fact, it's not like that. You cannot decolonize something just by simply fixing the symptoms of something that is so extremely broken. And I think that's the main issue with human rights. That's why this Hydra is not working. It's because you try to fix and make the small fixes into the system which was initially built as broken. And they are saying that decolonization is not a metaphor. We should not use it as an empty word. Otherwise, we deprive it of meaning. Otherwise, we do something that Putin is doing, saying that they are decolonizing. But in fact, the only ones who are decolonizing are Ukrainian people now in this situation. Yeah.
Could you please repeat the article Young?
Tuck and Young, decolonization is not a metaphor. From 2001, if I'm not mistaken, but I can email it to you if you email me. Yeah, I can email all the articles. Yes, and to finish, I would like to finish with this. I've talked about Françoise Verger. It's from her book called Decolonial Feminism. So she asks one major question, which is, who cleans the world? And it was as a response to protests in Gare du Nord, in France, in Paris, because she was saying that feminism was also viewed as a civilizational project. So we will go there and give you our vision of feminism, which does not include those invisible people, the people who do the invisible labor. And she asks, who cleans the world? Who cleans our offices? Who cleans our train stations? Who makes the operation of the world possible? And she offers a solution that perhaps we need to clean up our own crap, which I think is quite a good solution, and where decolonization needs to start. And I would like to end with saying that numerous possibilities of thinking decolonization exist. So there are many ways to think about it, many ways to approach it. It's obviously a bit easier for arts and theater and culture to do it because it's inherently grassroots, although it has quite a bad history. It's more difficult to to do it for somebody who does peace and conflict studies, for somebody who does international law, because the whole system is deeply built colonial. But we can move and think towards that direction. Thank you very much.
We have microphones now for questions and comments.
And maybe I will ask you some questions as well. Why are we silent? What purpose does it serve? What resonates with you the most in this essay? And maybe there is something in your experience that relates to her experience that you would like to talk about or to ask.
So anyone who wants to comment, I can give a microphone, or also just ask a question. I have even two of them. Also, just pass them on.
I actually have plenty of questions. Thank you very much. That was very inspiring. Thank you for your work, for everything and knowledge that you collect right now that helps people to understand what is actually happening. In order to speak up, like Audre Lorde suggests, the first step that I feel that I would need is to find a language. Mm-hmm. So my question would be to specific notions, if you know it. For example, white pass. I read about it in Feminist Translocalities, how to speak and how to speak in a non-racial way, please, without racism. And I haven't found anything about white pass as a notion. But it's used very well to the situation of, and the second notion, if you know it, Moscow-centric education. The situation that was described by Anna Gambaeva, I think, in her interpretation, where in different regions of Russian Federation or former Soviet Union, children in schools become an education and start to think as a person who comes from Moscow. Mm. And in the moment they leave school or to go out of the official education system, they confront the reality that is different. So it's this kind of schizophrenia that, or maybe a double consciousness that was described by Yuri Levada and Masha Gessen, between something that is happening in a private space and something that and actions that are. This is the questions to the notions, if you have ever heard them and know the origins of them. And the second point was to this idea at the very beginning that Russian government is appropriating the language of victims. And there is authors like Orlando Figes and also by many other authors who describe long-standing inferiority complexes of Russian elite that formed also in the 17th century and 18th century, as elites were speaking French. Inferiority complex to Western society and the superiority attitudes to Asiatic regions. Specifically, so this comes together to this double consciousness somehow and inherited. I wanted just to hear what you think about it, because maybe this is the root of misunderstanding of something that is happening in Russia by Walter Mignolo. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You can keep it, maybe we have extra one. The next one.
Should I go first? Thank you for this question. I think it has many layers. First, the concept and how we label things, I think it's important. I'm not very well familiar with literature on white past. I've heard it more in a colloquial use, I've read somewhere that our identities, they change as we change context, and sometimes in certain contexts where we can pass as white, in other contexts we're not. And it's quite interesting with respect to the arguments with respect to Eastern Europeans, because some argue that Eastern Europeans are treated better in terms of being migrants and refugees and the way the status is given to them. But others also argue that Eastern Europeans have never been white. So it changes. It's a scale. In terms of schizophrenia, I agree. I'm actually writing an article about melancholia and mourning, and in that article I argue that Russian society is in the state of melancholia. And the difference between melancholia and it's quite interesting because it's a psychoanalytic concept, schizophrenia. But in the case of melancholia, we don't let go. So we lose something, but we don't let go. And what we lost becomes very much part of our own self, becomes the part of our ego. And Freud quite famously said that the shadow of the ego fell on itself. So when we do not address our past, we cannot let it go. We think that there is this loved object, it's quite psychoanalytic terms, but there is a loved object that becomes part of our psyche and we hold on to it. And in that, I argue that the loved object in certain cases is Ukraine because it symbolizes something for Russia that it cannot let go. And then the society is in the state of melancholia. So they don't realize what is happening. They are like in this constant sleep, which leads me to, I'm happy that you brought this up because you brought up Masha Gessen, and that my immediate reaction was, so we often hear the question, what is liberal opposition doing, and that we have very little hope for liberal opposition, and I think that's where it went, and that's why the question of who cleans the world matters, because we need to reframe it as who cleans Russia. So if we want to speak about decolonization, we need to ask who cleans Russia. And I saw this very much on my own experience when I was doing field work with Memorial, how I was treated, not only in terms of being a young woman and hearing quite misogynist claims that were coming from them, but also from being a Central Asian. And it was a stark contrast because I would tell to my colleagues in Germany, for example, and they'd be like, oh, don't tell bad things about Memorial. I went to Memorial and they've been amazing. I was like, okay, of course. White, because if you're a German, you're a colleague. If you're Central Asian, they don't even want to talk to you. And this is very sad. And this is the face of Russian opposition. And I believe that if change will ever happen, if decolonization will ever happen, it will come from below. It will not be Russian opposition, it will not be bright and beautiful slogans, it will be very common people about whom we don't hear in the news. Indigenous people, yes. So.
And as you were talking about decolonial feminism, I was thinking about women, Almanach, Women in Russia, published 1997 by Tatiana Mamonova. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, she's using the term women in Russia while in accepting or considering the territorial field of Kazakhstan, Vilnius, and Ukraine, and everything else, which means for me that it wasn't addressed at all, but at the same time, this not speaking about something makes things also tangible at some point, and everything that that Verge is pointing out, 2023 was also mentioned in this almanac, which is totally inspiring.
That's quite interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting observation.
Thanks so much for the talk. It should be working, is it? Yeah, this is better. Thanks so much for the talk. I was thinking about the kind of the concerns of silence and speaking, and I will speak from my own particular position, which may be very different for other people who were impacted by the ongoing sort of legacy of Russia. So I grew up under Soviet military occupation in back then occupied Czechoslovakia. And the issue for me and people around me, and I run Central and East European Feminist Research Network of feminist researchers who have been working on decoloniality for years. We speak, we have written a shitload, and the problem isn't so much that we wouldn't be speaking, but that no one is listening. And not only that no one is listening, but the active silencing, the gaslighting, and beyond our oppressors, such as Russia, it's Western feminist silencing. It is also, I wrote recently a text on transnational feminist solidarity, looking at the series of Western feminist anti-war manifestos that actually undermine the safety of Ukrainian women in the middle of a military invasion and genocide. That kind of silencing, the absolute erasure of people and women in particular and fellow people who are oppressed on gender grounds by Russian imperial and colonial violence, and our quasi-feminist sisters in the middle of it, undermining our lives. And what is particularly heartbreaking for me is that it's not just white Western feminism, it's also a lot of global self-writing, and it's also, sadly, a lot of, Black feminist writing that we used to learn from and, appreciate and value. So I don't know if any of you know the letter that a Czechoslovak dissident, Jiří Pelikan, wrote to Angela Davis, and how she completely belittled or ignored the plight of political prisoners under state-organized socialism and the occupation by so-called Soviet Union. And those cases that have never been critically reflected upon or apologized for, acknowledged, as these really difficult cases where we come at liberational struggles from very different socio-historical perspectives, and we project something onto each other without actually paying attention to the different sort of legacies of imperialism, colonialism that play out very differently in different places around the world. I have also experienced Jasper Puar this way last summer at a conference. It was a completely heartbreaking talk that basically implied that we shouldn't support Ukraine because we would be emboldening Western imperialism in Israel. And I just thought, why can't we have a decolonial feminist thinking that actually challenges and opposes the dehumanization of Ukrainians and Palestinians at the same time? It's completely possible if we just actually listen to the people on the ground in every single different context, and who is their oppressor and what they need. And I just, I wonder how do we get there? How do we interconnect these struggles? Because it's the last year has been just particularly alienating from these streams of thoughts and the traditions of thoughts that a lot of us connected to, and now we can't. And I'm seeing how it brought us together. I've never had so many discussions with scholars from Central Asia and indigenous thinkers, colonized by so-called Russia, but like it's our bubble.
Yeah, indeed, yeah.
And it's been a lifeline, but it's a bubble.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, thank you for that, yes. Yeah. Yeah, indeed. Verger, she writes about celebrity feminism and how feminism became civilizational. Gives an example of hijab laws in France, and that certain types of feminism is allowed, other type is not allowed. And it became famous and popular. Yeah, there is quite a good book. It's called Feminism for 99%. But yeah, I know it's difficult. Even today, I am Central Asian. I hadn't quoted a single Central Asian author, mostly black and some from MENA. And my friend also told me she does education. She studies epistemology and epistemic violence, and somebody approached her and told her, why you aren't quoting a single black author? And she said, why aren't you quoting a single Central Asian author? And she writes about Central Asians, because now people expect you to quote black authors, but certain contexts receive more attention, so it's very much attention economy. I don't have a response to that. But the arguments of decolonial scholars would be that there is space for everyone. It doesn't mean that, okay, you're white and European, we will not listen to you. And there is space for all kinds of struggles, and we should rather work together. It's the decolonial praxis and create pluriversal world rather than one single world. But yeah, I don't have an answer to that, but thank you for sharing.
Hello. Yeah, thank you for the last comment. I don't have too much to add, but I did just want to jump off and say that I agree that silence takes on many forms today, and I think silence can be strategic in that way, where it's also used as a form of protection too. And I think when you examine like silence as a system maybe, then it's also worth asking who needs to be silent versus who should not necessarily be silent themselves. And so I think like depending on each of our contexts and the positions we're in there, it can make a larger difference to not be silent for one party than for another. Yeah,
thank you. Yes, it made me think about a book by Cynthia Cruz. It's called On Silence, and she talks about silence as a mechanism against capitalism, and she gives an example when your body also becomes silence, and she talks about anorexia, because you detach from the world, which is so unfair from neoliberal capitalism, and you say, I just don't want to participate. And she says that's why homeless people, they give a very powerful image, a very powerful message. They say we do not want to participate in the system, which is so broken. And she says, yes, silence is in a way to detach, even if silence sometimes also means not eating, in her case. But thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for your lecture. It was very interesting, and for me it was important that you accentuated this idea that the colonial ideas could be used in the Western world, and by putting an example in a very right-wing fashion, right? So, say in Latin America, it could be like justification for like anti-LGBT and all these things, but at the same time. I'm just interested. Yeah, I completely fully support Ukraine, but don't think that. I'm sorry to say this, but if to analyze some speeches by Zelensky, right, and you can see obviously, right, that in a way they could be anti-decolonial in terms of a lot of conservative politicians such as Boris Johnson in like England, Timothy Snyder, like conservative theorists, they're very visible and vocal about Ukraine now, and when Zelensky speaks that Ukraine defends Europe in ways very anti-decolonial, and I think it's obvious that it makes confusion in the West itself when some Western leftists can completely support Ukraine on this matter. So what do you think? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we receive many different messages, and sometimes they are quite confrontational, but it made me think about again what Putin does. It's what Tak and Yang call move to innocence. They misappropriate. They take away the attention. They completely reverse the idea of decoloniality itself. I can't comment on Ukraine because I don't study it and I'm not in a position. But it's very difficult because you believe in Mignola so much and you like him to a certain point, and then he says things like that. He called Russia the westernization force. But it's also important because this way we can think about non-Western imperialisms and non-Western colonialisms as well, because usually we think about West as a colonizing power, but Morocco colonized Western Sahara. There are other countries which colonize as well.
I come with like a direct response. I also wanted to add, like, what's for me a bit strange that a leftist person would think about a government being representative of the society also, like by default, and then listening to a president and then thinking that it's like reflecting what is actually happening. I mean, just as an idea.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much. This is saving my mental health to be in spaces like this. So thank you. I have a question and a comment. As a person who genuinely struggles with academia and academic knowledge, which is accumulated out there, up there, and never gets to general public, I wonder if you have ever thought of ways in which feminist decolonial thinking from our regions can be more publicly accessible knowledge. And even like, for example, if you would imagine you have whatever amount of money to do whatever you would want to do, with this knowledge to come to normal people who don't necessarily, like myself, honestly, I'm very far from academia, very intentionally, because it's so male-dominated, white, and so on. What would you do if you had, I don't know, $100,000, even more? Just saying. I think this is a question for colleague as well from the network. If you ever, I'm sure you have thought of this. So, what would you do? And then I have a comment about the fact that, like, speaking of silencing, I'm gonna put you on spot. I'm sorry. This is Tankhaya, everyone. I don't know if you know her. If you don't know, you should. I will never do a justice of explaining about the podcast that she's doing, so I'm gonna just pass the mic. Don't hate me, please. For everyone who speaks Russian, that is the political work I'm here for. You should be there as well. The podcast is called Republic Speaking. I mean, come on, you tell the story. But one of the most amazing things you can ever find on the internet these days is created by this very person here. So do you want to tell the story very briefly? Sorry.
That was a nice advertisement, actually, not planned. So yeah, it's a podcast dedicated to 6 Asian national republics of Russia. It's Kalmykia, Buryatia, Tuva, Sakha, Khakassia, and Altai. The problem is, until now, our republics are misrepresented in the Russian media. People usually talk about the negative statistics, which is true, but they do not provide any context, like why, for example, Republic of Tuva, my homeland, is the poorest region of Russia and everything. And also there is a lot of exoticization of our cultures, like shamanism and everything. So the thing is, everything real about us is just left out of everything. Our just usual lives, why we're so poor, why there is so why there are so high numbers of people dying in Ukraine, I mean, from our republics. Why is mobilization is actually ethnically characterized. But in the podcast, we don't actually speak about those topics. We just, the whole reason, the whole aim is just to provide people the platform to speak about their usual lives. So it's just local people, which is the whole concept, like locals talking about their lives, not just others. And here I just take over the possibility to actually ask a question. I really love the title of the lecture, Not in Our Names, because this is something that really resonates with me, and because many people in Russia, not only Russia, but specifically in Russia, like ethnically Russians or just white people, they speak about our regions, I mean, indigenous people of Russia, very much, very often, talking about that we are poor, our languages are dying, etc. And I quit reading and just percepting all those contexts because they speak about us, not including us in the dialogue. So my question is, and I do not expect you to give me any universal solution, just a personal opinion, I guess, how to stop them doing this? Like, no one should talk about us just because, I don't know, they have a platform, they have a blog or whatever, some media possibilities. Even from the, I guess, research frame, because it's the subject-object relationships when you are the subject and you're researching the objects like other nations and everything. So that's actually it, because I was interested that you said that you're writing an article like Melancholy in Russia or whatever, and you're from Turkmenistan, which is kind of related, I guess, to my question as well. So, Republic speaking. Yes, it's in Russian. I mean, it's also in native languages because people send their voice messages in our Telegram bot. Yes, so thank you, Nina, for this promotion.
Thank you. Yeah, this sounds fascinating, the podcast. That's the... I am an international lawyer. After all, I study international law. The main subjects of international law are states. I don't like it, but that's how we look at that. And the representatives of states are presidents, so we need to look at that. I'm also studying memory, and there are different forms of memory, and this may be address Vika's comment and your question. There is also a memory which is implicit. So if you hear the same message over and over again, it gets embedded into your consciousness. And we all know how strong malignant propaganda in Russia is. And yeah, the big question is why so many people buy it. But obviously, it's very difficult to speak on behalf of everyone, and there are different groups of people. And obviously, society is not a homogeneous one single institution. So yeah, I don't have an answer to your question, obviously. But hopefully things, it feels like in academia right now it's changing. There are more platforms for different people to speak. Russia is vilified, but without considering different groups that live in Russia, and maybe, I don't know, somebody is interested in that. But yet, I don't have an answer. But thank you. It was interesting to hear about your podcast.
Comments? Questions? And I have one comment about, maybe it's like an issue thing, so we don't have to stop on it a lot, but you had this comment about Atkins, and you mentioned that he's criticized, but you still kind of cite him, because he was the first to speak about certain things. And for me, it seems like the first people were actually the Ukrainian scholars, who were studying literature mostly, but also politics, and they were writing before Atkins, but maybe it was not a book, that's why not so known, I don't know, but there are several people who still are active who did this, because that's why also it was like not something that was for me like the first, but he was the first to speak about internal colonialism in Russia, but also from a perspective which was like without race, just about everyone being a peasant or like a master, and that's why I think mostly like the community in Russia also is critical, because he's being the universal public speaker for decolonization, even though he's actually erasing some parts of it which are crucial.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, maybe it's more important to quote Tlostanova in that case because she's an indigenous scholar.
Yeah, thank you so much. And if you have further questions, comments, you can also have some drinks and stay for a bit. We're not immediately ending, so yeah.